Great. So being wedged between the party and that last extremely impressive panel is obviously, that was a hard act to follow. But I think I'm here to bring good news. The title of this panel, Lying in Politics, Weaponizing Fake News and Attacking Journalists, What Have We Learned So Far? And how to react to the infodemic. I'd say we've learned a lot, actually, and that there's a lot we can do, including to address the problems of the previous panel. And I think it largely is a question of political will, but the solutions are out there. Since 2016, I think when mis and disinformation really kind of rose to the popular consciousness, journalists have been extremely active on the front lines. They took it personally, because journalism believes in fact-checking, in accuracy, in scientific method. And so journalists have done an enormous amount to try to combat the problems of mis and disinformation online and attacks on journalism. This panel really represents some of those efforts. We have people who have exposed the problem and documented it and found patterns and explained it. We have people who have worked in fact-checking and creating a culture of truth and verification. And also, I'm hoping Sérgio will answer the question, the key question of how do you rebuild trust after your Bolsonaro leads office. I'm just going to go back a little bit and go through this slide. My most popular class at Columbia University, I'm at the School of International and Public Affairs, just discovered that Glenn is one of our illustrious alumni. And Khaya, of course, is Barnard and the Journalism School. But I teach a course called Policy Solutions for Mis and Disinformation Online. And what I started to do in 2017 was build a taxonomy, an analytical framework to understand the solutions. And I divided them into demand and supply side, which for all you communication scholars in the room, I know is not exactly how we think about two-step flow and processing of information, but I found that it was easy. And it made sense to my students. And the demand side solutions are the solutions which affect the demand for mis and disinformation. And those include things like media literacy, where we're trying to boost discernment and help audiences become more critical and thoughtful about what they consume and what they forward. Building trust in media is also explaining our methods and the processes so that people, again, understand what the differences are. I also think that in some ways covering mis and disinformation, whether you're an academic or reporter, is also aimed at raising awareness. And on the supply side, I divide it into two categories. So there are supply side interventions which try to create better and more reliable information. So that would be philanthropic of quality journalism, supporting public service broadcasting, all the measures that governments have taken around the world since 2019. That would be, again, reporting in an accurate way. The attempts by the big tech companies after COVID got started to do things like give reliable information. If you search, Bill Gates and microchips, you might get a panel that tells you, this is where you can get a COVID vaccine. This is a WHO website with reliable information. So those are all supply-side interventions that are aimed at boosting the supply. And then the other form of supply-side interventions are the ones that try to downrank or block poor quality information. And that could be anything from Dominion voting machines suing Fox, or the fake news laws that many people have alluded to in the previous panel, or I would say the Digital Services Act in Europe. But the point is, there's a lot of interventions out there. Countries are choosing, and organizations are choosing the ones that they think makes the most sense for them. We have a lot of Brazilians in the room today. Brazil is obviously in the middle of big policy discussions, cases coming before the Supreme Court. So I think mostly what we're going to be talking about, I think these are largely demand-side interventions, but I think they're critical, and I think that I won't talk more about our I finished a long paper about fighting propaganda in the 1930s. There's a lot of similarities. Maybe we'll get to it later. But Clyde Miller, who founded the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, said that, because of the First Amendment, combating false information with accurate information is the American way. And I think a lot of what you're doing is actually that. So take it away. I think that we've got Khaya coming first, because I thought your work exposing would make a great place for us to start. Thank you so much for having us.
Just waiting for my, that's okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting two case studies based on reporting that I've done to help illustrate how best to combat fake news. So here we go. So the first one is understanding the misinformation environment, understanding that misinformation often starts in small, obscure places before it goes viral. And the second one is knowing when to expect misinformation, being aware that misinformation often follows a very consistent pattern. So the first case study is on Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman, who were two Fulton County election workers who filed a defamation lawsuit against the Gateway Pundit in 2021. And the Gateway Pundit is a far-right news organization and a frequent purveyor of misinformation. The Gateway Pundit wrote a series of stories on these two women, alleging that they were involved in a voter fraud scandal involving suitcases of illegal ballots. So the rumor was debunked very quickly, but they doubled down on the story, this news organization, and they continued to write stories about these women. They actually wrote a story where they named them explicitly, and the rumor went out of control from there. It reached right-wing circles, and it actually became a talking point for Trump, who named them explicitly in his famous phone call with the Georgia Secretary of State. As a result of this rumor, these two women feared for their lives. Their professional reputations were marred. They received death threats, so it was a very powerful case. Okay, so the takeaway here is that, again, misinformation often starts in these very small, dark corners of the internet, and it's really easy to underestimate the power of something like the Gateway Pundit. Most people might not have even heard of it, but it's really dangerous. And if we want to get ahead of misinformation, it's important to cut it off at its source and correct the record before it goes viral. These rumors don't exist in a vacuum. They develop in this misinformation environment, and sometimes understanding where it develops is just as important as the actual rumor once the rumor becomes a talking point for the former president. So the second case study is on the East Palestine train derailment. So after the East Palestine train derailment, February of this year, there was very little government instruction about what exactly needed to be done, how concerned residents needed to be, how dangerous the situation was. And in the absence of clear government instruction, misinformation flooded the scene. Conspiracy theorists stepped in and spread rumors. They were all sort of the same, but they alleged that the danger was far greater than was being reported, and that it was being deliberately misreported on behalf of the Biden administration. So it's not surprising that misinformation flooded the scene after the East Palestine train derailment. It's often the case that after these unprecedented events, natural disasters, a January 6th, shootings, any sort of tragedy like that, it's very easy for conspiracy theorists to step in when details are still murky, when the government doesn't respond quickly. It's in this environment that people often can't even differentiate between fact and fiction because the events that they themselves are experiencing seem unbelievable, and misinformation spreaders will take advantage of this moment. And again, understanding this pattern can help us be less reactive. We don't necessarily have to be surprised every time a misinformation campaign happens after an event like this. We can know to expect it. So, in conclusion, fake news is not going anywhere. It's here to stay, unfortunately. But there are things we can do to get ahead of it. Being, again, less reactive to it, knowing the patterns, knowing the environment can help us respond quicker. And sometimes it seems a little doom and gloom, so much misinformation, but it's still our responsibility as reporters to seek truth where we find it and to hold purveyors of misinformation accountable. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Good. So, Bill, did you want to, I don't know if this is working, but Bill, did you want to talk about some of the work that you're doing?
You bet, and I'll actually build on your excellent slide, Anya. I thought your point about the ecosystem is really important, that to look at not just the role that fact checkers play, but to look at everything that's being done, because I think that's what we need to think about misinformation in a big global sense. And so I have just a couple of points I want to make today. One is that fact-checking needs a reboot. Fact-checking is failing to reach the people that need it the most. And I say that as the founder of PolitiFact. We started PolitiFact in 2007, and we had this naive idea, at least I did, that people were going to come to our website and find the truth. And of course, the problem is that the people who come to the website aren't the people who really need it. And so all along, we have tried to find ways to get the content to the people who really need it, but that's not happening. And in fact, the people who really need it actively dislike fact checkers. And so we need to find ways to get the content to them. So enter this new opportunity at this moment, and I hope you saw the panel, the tremendous panel this morning on AI. Generative AI gives us a whole new opportunity to get accurate content to people. It also, unfortunately, gives the bad guys new ways to get false information to people. So we're in a whole different environment that we really just discovered in the last few months, and we have to think about a whole new battlefield. But at the root of it, the individual fact check still matters a lot. And I'm glad to be sitting next to Glenn and Khaya, both of whom have worked, in the case of Khaya, in the case of Glenn, at news organizations that, when they create fact checks, make what's called claim review, which is a structured database that we helped create with Google, that is an open schema, that is a database that generative AI will be able to draw from, and can draw from, to find accurate content. So all these mistakes that are being made, that we can make generative AI smarter. One other important point I want to make, this grows out of a report that we just made in the Duke, just published in the Duke Reporters Lab, local fact checking. So we studied local fact checking in 2022, and we found that despite this general impression we've had that fact checking has been growing, that politicians are being held accountable for what they say, that isn't happening at the local level. Just a couple of scary numbers. Fewer than half of the governors had even a single statement checked by fact checkers. Only 33 of 435 US representatives were checked. That means only 8% of US reps were checked. Who knows what the percentage was for the people running for those seats? Out of 7,386 state legislative seats, only 47 were fact-checked. So we need a lot more fact-checking at the local level. So I'll end with one more point. AI allows us to create more fact-checking in some very creative ways. And one of the things that I asked the panel this morning was, how can we break out of the old way of thinking in newsrooms to do things in new ways. And I think we need to do that with how we hold public officials accountable.
Bill, I interviewed a lot of fact checkers for my PhD thesis on solutions for mis and disinformation. And in many parts of the world, certainly not the US under Trump, fact checking gave politicians pause. And they were sometimes a little more careful about what they said because they knew they could be fact checked. So in that sense, it's a little bit like the sort of watchdog or scarecrow role of journalism. So I did want to just flag that, and I know Glenn has prepared remarks, but I bet you're going, when you talk about the effect. So in other words, I think I'm more cheerful than you. Rather than failing, I would say evolving, and there can be deterrent effects.
I'm with you,
right?
and I'm with you, and I am not pessimistic about its impact. We just need to infuse it with some new energy and new thinking.
Great, okay, Glenn, I don't want to cut into your time.
So thank you for having me here. I've been running the Washington Post Fact Checker for more than a dozen years. The Fact Checker initially started in 2007, incidentally at about the same time as PolitiFact. And both organizations had the same concept, ratings of statements made by politicians. At the Fact Checker, we use a Pinocchio scale with 4 Pinocchios being the most egregious misstatement. Now, the Fact Checker was originally created for the 2008 election, just for that, and so it was shut down after Barack Obama was elected. But editors noticed continuing traffic for old fact checks as people Googled for information, and they asked me to revive it as a permanent feature in 2011. And when I started, the bread and butter was the same as before, fact checks of discrete statements by politicians. My background is writing about public policy, foreign and domestic, so I designed the fact checks to be guides to complex policy debates. The politician's statement was merely a jumping-off point to unravel a difficult policy issue. I've found over time that the more complex an issue is, the more susceptible it is to misleading claims by politicians. Now, it turns out that 2011 was also a consequential year for social media. The number of monthly Twitter users doubled in 2011 and then doubled again in 2012. The number of monthly Facebook users increased 50% in 2011 and reached 1 billion in 2012. That shift in the delivery of information, or misinformation, also changed the nature of fact-checking. Increasingly, readers were not asking me for fact checks of statements they heard the president say on television. Instead, they wanted to know if something was true that they discovered on social media. Politicians started using Twitter to deliver political messages. At the time, the maximum length of a tweet was just 140 characters, so that often led to facts being twisted or left to the side. You wouldn't believe how many times I heard a flack blame Twitter's character limit for a misleading tweet. Eventually, of course, misleading videos made their way onto social media. These videos were snipped or framed in a way to generate outrage and produce a viral moment. This led to another level of fact-checking. And then Donald Trump was elected president, despite an avalanche of falsehoods that had been relentlessly fact-checked by the Post, by PolitiFact, by other news organizations. Now, was that a failure of fact-checking? Not necessarily. Trump's secret sauce was that he repeated lies that his supporters already believed. Millions of illegal aliens crossed the southern border every year. Thousands of Muslims in Jersey City cheered the September 11 attacks. That sort of thing. Trump had been a careful listener of right-wing radio, and before Trump, an ordinary Republican politician would have rarely made such an outrageous statement. But for the hardcore of the Republican Party, Trump sounded like a person who was finally telling the truth. The Trump experience, which included a project at the Post where we counted more than 30,000 false or misleading statements made by Trump during his presidency, has led to some rethinking of fact-checking at the Post. The challenge we face going forward is that the people who most would learn from fact checks are most likely to tune us out, just as Bill said. People who on the right love to circulate fact checks of people on the left. People on the left love to circulate fact checks of people on the right, but they ignore or dismiss fact checks of their ideological brethren. So while we continue to issue Pinocchio ratings when appropriate, we are also publishing articles that outline what the truth is. For instance, on the eve of the 2012 election, we published an article titled, the truth about election fraud. It's rare. So rather than get mired in fact checks of specific election fraud claims, I instead took a broad look at documented instances of election fraud and showed how few cases there were. That article attracted a large audience. I'm also increasingly tracing the flow of misinformation, something that Khaya talked about. One thing that has been relentlessly fact-checked was the claim that athletes are suddenly collapsing because of the COVID vaccine. It had been repeatedly documented as false by fact-checkers around the world. So I took a different approach. I showed how the story had its roots in mysterious Austrian websites with ties to that country's far-right populist party, the Freedom Party. Those stories were then recycled by right-wing media in the United States. The article I wrote continues to attract a large amount of traffic a year after being published. Similarly, I traced a false claim that there was new evidence Hillary Clinton had spied on Donald Trump. It had appeared all over right-wing media, but I found it had started with an anonymous Twitter account that had mischaracterized a legal filing. This approach appears more effective in engaging readers than just slapping Pinocchios and politicians that had repeated the claim. Now, the rise of AI will pose a new challenge, I'm sure. At the Post, we tested some claims in ChatGPT, and we found that it relied on fact checks, and it produced some reasonably acceptable answers 6 out of 10 times. Now, 3 out of 10 times it was pretty sketchy, and 1 out of 10 times it was completely false. We tested this using the chat function on Bing, which Bing actually will let you see the sources, so we were able to examine what the sources of information were. And in one case, it was PolitiFact. In one case, it was me, so that wasn't terrible. But of course, fakery is going to emerge in ChatGPT, and I'm sure it's only a matter of time before it's weaponized to spread false information.
Glenn, I think that your point about tracking the sources of the Austrian website is really important. I think and the idea that fact-checking, as you said, isn't just claim review, but looking at the origins and the transmission. I would also, Khaya and I were just talking about the financial motivations. One of the most important pieces for me was the piece that the Post published years ago, maybe you wrote it, about vaccine disinformation and how it was a hedge fund guy in New York and his wife who had funded those first videos on YouTube that spread. And I think it's too easy for people to say like, ooh, there's these weirdos out there, isn't it strange? And much more important to kind of systematically figure out what are the financial motivations. Some of these very small messaging apps now that want to start doing payments platforms and payment systems, that's when we can get in and regulate, when it hits up against the banking sector. So I think as journalists, the reporting and the broader view that you're espousing of fact-checking, I think is very significant. Will you be doing more of that, like the Austrian article that you mentioned?
Oh yeah. No, I think it's a fun bit of reporting too. So it's enjoyable to do. But I think it also helps people understand that these things don't come out of a vacuum. But there are bad actors out there that have reasons for spreading this misinformation.
That's right, and it's amazing how people don't know that. 6-7 years ago, my students thought I was a weirdo because I cared about online mis and disinformation. Now everyone's confused. Oh, there's all this stuff, I don't know where it comes from. So when you can send them a Washington Post article saying, actually, this is where it came from, and this is how it's spreading, and this is who's making money, it's, I think, incredibly informative. Sérgio, I know that Brazilian journalists have been really at the forefront of getting together during election time, fact-checking together, breaking down barriers. We've seen that in Ecuador, we've seen that in Mexico, Argentina. To me, that's a very Latin American response because we're not seeing regulation in most of Latin America, except for Brazil. So I think you were going to show us a video that was going to talk about some of what the Brazilian journalists have been doing. Yeah. And then I am going to pin you down to talking about rebuilding because seeing how countries deal with electoral, post-election, return to democracy, I think is also really important. So thank you very much. Please come. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you, Rosenthal, and your great team. Thank you, Anya and colleagues. It's an honor. I ask you to bear with me because my English is a little bit rusty, but I'll try anyway. Well, as Anya said, I'll try to wrap up what happened to the press in Brazil under Bolsonaro. Yeah, that's, Rosenthal, try to fit that into a headline. It's the biggest title of a panel here. Well, I try and summarize the panel's theme through Bolsonaro attack on media in Brazil. And of course, starting of course with Folha de São Paulo, that's the newspaper I run, and one of his most frequent targets. Folha has been doing critical reporting on Bolsonaro since at least 2017, when he was a long shot from being a serious contender. These are some of our scoops on his assets. The first one, his attacks on a former wife, the third one, and the main scoop that companies were paying for a massive attack on his opponent, Fernando Haddad, spreading fake news on WhatsApp. Brazil, as you know, is the largest country in WhatsApp users, behind only of India. Since he chose Folha de São Paulo as his main target, we put together a video with the best of Bolsonaro's, or the worst of Bolsonaro's attack on Folha. What you're going to see are interactions between Bolsonaro and Folha reporters, and statements that he made on the newspaper, ranging from 2017 till 2022. Do I have to do? Oh, okay.
Folha de São Paulo! Geralmente a Folha de São Paulo começa com tudo. Toda a fonte do mal é a Folha de São Paulo. Primeiro, você da Folha de São Paulo tem que entrar de novo numa faculdade que presta e fazer um bom jornalismo. Determinei hoje que seja cancelada a assinatura da Folha de São Paulo aqui no âmbito do Poder Executivo.
Então o senhor não quer que esse jornal acabe?
Eu não entendi a tua pergunta. Que jornal? A Folha de São Paulo, Folha de São Paulo, a Folha de São Paulo. Vocês da Folha estão fazendo um trabalho porco.
Eu acho que eu tenho que me respeitar.
Eu abri uma concessão para conversar contigo aqui.
Agradeço.
Você faz um trabalho porco com a Folha de São Paulo. Tem mais graça falar Datafolha aqui. Datafolha não, data fake. Outra pergunta. Folha de São Paulo, outra pergunta. Ah, da Folha de São Paulo. Outra pergunta, por favor.
Você vai manter o Fábio no Secom?
Você é da Folha de São Paulo? Olha a jornalista da Folha de São Paulo. Você faz um vídeo dela aí. Ela queria um furo. Ela queria dar um furo. Tem aquele escândalo, Folha de São Paulo, fantasma, não sei o quê.
Essa informação é uma mentira. Essa informação é uma mentira. O senhor está repetindo essa informação.
Folha de São Paulo. Não tem notícia boa lá. Com essa história desimbrochável, a Folha vai atrás. Sexo. Problemas de ereção atinge cerca de 70% dos homens na idade de Bolsonaro. Lula, minha fonte é o IPEA. O teu é a Folha de São Paulo. Pelo amor de Deus, Lula. Mando pra Folha. Eles ignoram, continuam batendo em cima. Essa é a Folha de São Paulo. Eu quero elogiar hoje, para encerrar, né, o jornal A Folha de São Paulo. Parabéns, Folha de São Paulo. Na Folha publica, todo mundo replica. Folha de São Paulo! Geralmente a Folha de São Paulo.
Sérgio, did the attacks help your circulation?
Initially, yes, but then we experienced the Bolsonaro bump, as you did with Trump's bump, but then we had the same effect after he left office, and I mean it was like this. So yeah, initially yes. But initially, we planned this as a piece of advertising, but then we thought it would be too aggressive. It would be playing by Bolsonaro's rules. So I just showed this in events like this. By the way, the full video is already running about 10 minutes now. So if anyone want to see the whole piece, I can send it afterwards. Of course, these attacks on Folha and other media outlets had an impact in the whole news environment. Starting on reporters, we saw an increase in violence against journalists during Bolsonaro's term. The same was true on advertising. Advertisers, a lot of advertisers were afraid of what government could do to them if they printed an advertisement on Folha, and that was an issue as well. Intimidation of journalists were another problem. The main target of Bolsonaro when attacking journalists were female reporters, such as Patrícia Campos Melo and Vera Magalhães. By the way, both are here today. And he did that through threaten and slander, and since Patrícia was the author of the main scoop during the 2018 campaign, she became the main target. One of the newspapers, I'll give two examples when I say campaign. One of the newspapers' WhatsApp numbers received 220,000 threatening or hostile messages from 5,000 different numbers. Just go back. You saw that in video, but it was hard to catch because it was in Portuguese and it was very fast. But we also experienced online sexual harassment led by Bolsonaro and his sons against Patrícia. The president made a joke using a pun with the word furo in Portuguese, which means both scoop and anus, implying that the reporter offered sex in exchange for a scoop. He said that on live TV. And of course, Bolsonaro's effect had an impact on transparency as well. During his 4 years in the office, the Brazilian equivalent of FOIA was virtually dormant for 4 years. And the same happened regarding the COVID coverage. That was other of his main targets. At some point during the beginning of the COVID in Brazil, I think March or April of 2020, the government decided to simply cease to turn public the official numbers for COVID. Instead, they created the so-called scoreboard of life, where the administration would release only the number of survivors, not the number of people who died of COVID. So that led to an unprecedented decision for the main media outlets in Brazil to put together their data teams and start scrapping ourselves for the numbers. This quickly became the de facto official death toll in Brazil for years. It was the numbers were released by the consortium twice a day, and we stopped doing that only 2 months ago, when the government under Lula started to releasing the trustworthy numbers again, facts again. And the final item is Bolsonaro against democracy. Of course, like his American mentor, Bolsonaro also tried to mess with presidential elections that we had in 2022. And we even had our version of the Capitol attacks that happened exactly 1 year and 2 days after the US. Well, and I end answering what Anya asked, what about news after Bolsonaro? Looking forward, what do we do from now on? that we have a president committed to democracy, but an opposition leader that is not going anywhere. Strategic silence, I don't think it's an option. It doesn't matter if we don't report on them, they are not going anywhere. The same with reporting on the extremist movements that have consolidated in Brazil is also essential. And how do we do that? I think that we have to do what we always did. We have to keep doing professional journalism in the case of Folha, what we have been doing for the last century. That's journalism that's based on critical, plural, non-partisan, and independent journalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sérgio. Have media outlets made, I know that globally there's been a large movement of community engagement and trust with journalists, and in the post-Bolsonaro era, have Brazilian journalists done new efforts? Have they talked to people and said, we're back, or we're different, or we're changing our practice, or we're going to be different next time? Like, did you all feel that the change in government was a chance to kind of do a reset with audiences at all, or we don't have to be as partisan? Sorry, I have the mic.
Well, actually, the shorter answer is no. We kept doing what we do best. It's going after the facts, going after the stories, pursuing the stories, even regarding this current administration, and trying to get the best version of truth that it's available, the most accurate version of truth that it's available. I start to see a movement in Brazilian, part of Brazilian society that I think you saw here in the US as well, that we shouldn't report on Bolsonaro and his cronies. For me, this is kind of a magical thinking. If we close our eyes, they will go away. Well, they won't, to begin with. And I think that's more effective if we keep reporting on this group, this politician. That's what we've been saying to our audience. I'll give you an example. In the second round of 2022 presidential elections in Brazil, it was the most close outcome in the last decades, and it was 51% for Lula and 49% for Bolsonaro. And one of the things that, according to what we heard from Bolsonaro's campaign afterwards, one of the things that helped move the needle towards Lula, he won for less than 2 million votes, was a scoop that we have that Folha ran days before the second round. It was a very solid scoop saying that Bolsonaro was planning this year, if he was elected, to change the rules for minimum wage and social security. And we heard from Bolsonaro's people that this scoop, between other facts, but this scoop was one of the things that moved the needle towards Lula. So what's the lesson here for us? We have to stick with professional journalism. I think that these 4 years in Brazil and the 6 years that here in the US was the biggest stress test for professional journalism. And I think that we change the rules, we change what we do best, they will won. We can change how we do things. They have to change how they act.
Sérgio, thank you so much for that. Really interesting. Some questions are coming in from people online, and I want to kind of expand on them. So I think I have one for each of you. Glenn, I was very curious to know what the discussions are at the Washington Post, given that elections are coming up in 2024. Are people saying, gee, we better not amplify Trump, or are they taking more the Sérgio view that if we, try not to we can't make this go away? I thought your phrase of magical thinking was very telling. What's the discussion at the Post like?
Well, we obviously cover Trump. Trump is going to be a very strong candidate for the Republican nomination, and in fact, if you believe the polls, he's solidly ahead to win the Republican nomination, and if he wins the nomination, he is as good a shot as any to become president again. So obviously, we have to cover Donald Trump. I think if there's a rethinking, it's that we're trying to be more strategic about how we cover him. He says lots and lots of things on his social media site, Truth Social. He makes all sorts of speeches that are outrageous. And the trick is to find your shots and find out the moments to highlight and examine that. So I've purposely stepped back and not done many fact checks of Trump. I need to find a moment when it makes sense. And so one I had done late last year, because it was actually a policy issue. He was saying he had a policy that he was going to execute drug dealers. And so I wrote a piece that explained why all the facts he used to justify such a draconian policy was made up and based on fantasy. So that was seemed like a way to get into talking about Donald Trump. And I think, he's actually, I don't know if people have seen this, but he has this kind of TV channel on Rumble where every day he posts like a new policy position. And, so we're carefully tracking those to find, to write about him in terms of his policy objectives if he became president. So, to treat him seriously, but not to give him the blanket coverage about everything that he says.
Presumably the policy of the day is sort of trial balloon to see what gets response from his followers?
Yes, I think that's part of it. I also think that Trump recognizes that he can't only be like a candidate of grievance. Or at least his staff realizes that. But these are actually videos where Trump himself is directly addressing the camera and saying, "This is what I'm going to do, and here are my policy ideas." And while his speeches continue to be mostly grievance, he does seem to be suggesting that he understands that as a president you need to have policies that you want to implement.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we know from the Philippines that executing, drug dealers or whoever can be very popular. Look at Duterte's approval ratings. Okay, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions for Bill before I turn to Khaya. There are a few people are coming. One, okay, let me just combine here. Artificial intelligence, you've said that it can help fight mis and disinformation or be a good tool for fact-checking, but isn't AI part of the problem? So how would you control it? And then ditto social media. Can it be used to help address the problem, or in fact, is it the main vector? And I would just add, I saw Santiago Lyons is here and we'll be doing a content provenance breakfast tomorrow. My impression from talking to people like Gordon Krovitz is that the platforms, the messaging apps could actually do a lot more themselves if they wanted to, right? That watermarking and some of the content provenance things that Santi and TruePic, Munir Ibrahim and others are working on really could go a long way to kind of labeling and preventing. So I guess I'm combining a few different sort of technical fixes to my question.
You bet.
Thank you, Bill.
Great questions. So the first one, AI, problem and solution, yes. Problem, we're only beginning to see it, and I think I remember attending a variety of sessions about how deep fake videos were going to be the big problem in like 2011, 2012, 2013, And it took really until now for deepfake videos to really get good. And they're actually not that good now, but they've gotten pretty good, particularly still images. Those images that of Trump getting arrested before he was actually arrested were pretty powerful, except for the whole finger thing. So AI will be a huge way that the forces of evil spread misinformation. It can also be an incredibly effective way to combat misinformation because it can help us detect the misinformation, and it can help us clone fact checks and deploy them quickly where they're needed. So this local fact-checking problem, we can use AI to generate new fact checks from the misinformation at the local level. We have a concept we call half-baked pizza, where the AI will generate a written fact check. It'll be reviewed by a human fact checker to make sure that it's accurate, that it doesn't contain those mistakes. Think of it like the half-baked pizza you get at Costco. And then we put it in the oven, and it goes to some local area that does not have fact-checking. So I think it can be part of the solution, and we have some other ideas like that too. Social media, same way. You know, social media right now is both things. The problem, and this is what we call the Uncle Bob problem, the problem is that we're not reaching Uncle Bob, who's falling for these things. And that's something also that perhaps can be addressed by AI. And then the final question had to do with...
I feel like you basically, well, I can't even remember my final question, but I want to say this is all super interesting. Is this all in your new report? Can we go to
so the new report deals just with local fact-checking. And is really about the problem, and read it and get depressed. It's just appalling how little local officials are being held accountable for what they say.
Well, good. But I like your optimism about AI. This is great, and this is not what I've been hearing lately, so I'm even happier. I know the audience will want to ask questions, but I can't resist asking Khaya something. You said that you've worked for outlets with different political perspectives. And one thing I think about all the time, and I'll probably have to talk a little bit about, is the different partisan takes on the problem of disinformation. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, did you find that your editors or publishers had different views at the different places where you worked, depending on their politics?
Different views on fact-checking?
Yeah, or just the problem. I mean, we're seeing, right, these attacks on academics that are studying mis and disinformation, hearings in Washington saying it's, it's not really a problem, it's something, a woke culture thing. How did you experience these different perspectives on the problem in your offices?
Fact-checking in both of my, I guess I only fact-checked in one newsroom, it wasn't really presented as a partisan issue. It just, facts are facts. Things that are wrong. If you can prove that it's wrong, then it's wrong. It's sort of win above politics. I think I worked at a center-right news organization, and I think we got a lot of questioning people who thought maybe we were spending too much time fact-checking the left, not the right, and vice versa. But it didn't really come up as an issue.
So they accepted the idea that fact checks were essential.
Oh, for sure.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it was a big part of
because I feel like a lot of this discussion, especially when we look at Brazil and the previous panel, is about the point that when there's polarization, truth is on the front line and journalists are on the front line. And I'll just mention that one of the first media literacy programs in the world was at Columbia University in the 1930s, and it was founded by a former journalist called Clyde Miller. Some of his papers are actually here at University of Texas. And he ended up, he got very involved in the anti-racist education movement, which was also a very big movement of the 1930s, because they believed that racism was the worst form of propaganda. Anyway, end of story. They all got fired from Columbia. They lost their housing, and they got investigated by the precursor of the McCarthy era. And so what I'm interested in is, I feel like the attacks right now on the whole problem of mis and disinformation, where Republicans are saying it's not even a problem, and it's almost falling out of fashion to study it. So I was curious to know if you've seen that phenomenon and what you think of it.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Kaya's previous employer, the Dispatch, a wonderful conservative outlet, for having making the commitment to fact checking. I wish there were more conservative outlets that did that. One of the things we've learned from the Dominion case is how fact checking was not popular at Fox, and it would be great to see more fact-based reporting at conservative organizations.
So you have the impression that I do, that this, even saying there's a problem about truth is becoming a bit of has become a partisan issue in this country.
It's a little frightening.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, the Dispatch does really good work. I mean, it's so, and they're very serious about it.
Yeah.
So it's that, to me, is gratifying to see that,
That's terrific. That's great. And
it's not
Sérgio,
just a left-right thing.
Yeah, and we're going to watch with interest because Kaya's employer just got taken over by a new company. But you were at the Grid and now you're at the Messenger, so you're no
yeah,
longer at the
I'm
Dispatch,
at the Messenger.
just to clarify. So we'll be watching with interest. And Sérgio, please come in here.
Yeah, if I can just add the Brazilian perspective of fact-checking, we are experiencing a different kind of problem. With this current administration, Lula's administration, they are planning to release an official fact-checker agency. That's just absurd. That's just Orwellian, if you come to think of it. So that's what happened when. I mean, if you have Bolsonaro in power, you deal with a set of problems, much more serious set of problems. But it's not different when you have a democratic president that's committed to democracy, because they still want to control the narrative somehow. And in case of Lula, they are trying to do this federal fact-checking agency.
Well, this is great timing because a question that came in for you is asking whether Lula's government is going to be more respectful of freedom of expression and of the work of the media in comparison to Bolsonaro.
Oh yeah, much more respectful. I mean, the problems are different from the previous administration. He's not trying to do a coup. He's not trying to mine democracy in Brazil. So the relationship between this administration and the press is much more healthy. But it's tense. It's like always, but much more respectful. Yes.
Both grabbed your mics. So
I wanted to make the point that just like Brazil, India is having exactly the same situation. And I always take that as flattery, that the government is so impressed with fact-checking that they want to get into our business.
Khaya, did you have something to add?
No.
I didn't want to. And we also got a little reminder. I love that we have so many people online watching, saying a good example of the use of AI in fact-checking was developed by Chequeado in Argentina. So I saw Laura Sommer here earlier today, so I'm glad there's a shout out for her. I hope we can keep talking, but I'm wondering if there's questions from the audience. Good. It's hard to see. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm Joy Mayer from Trusting News, and I will add my applause to the Dispatch's fact-checking. I'm a big fan. I'm really hoping they can reach Bill's Uncle Bob, and I wonder what you guys have learned about the problem of, fact checks are, you can slap the word fact check on anything. Fact checks are only credible to you if you find the messenger of the fact check credible. And I wonder what you guys are learning about how to persuade skeptical audiences that your fact checks are credible.
I get it's a slow process, and I think the biggest problem we face in fact-checking is confirmation bias. I mean, people pay attention to things that confirm what they already believe, and fact-checkers are in the business of coming up and saying, no, what you believe is wrong, and that's very difficult for people to accept. And the one thing that I've encountered over the last dozen years is, and this is in part the Trump effect, is that increasingly the attacks are when people don't like the message, whether it's on the right or the left, you get attacked as a way to discredit you as a future messenger. So I have come under tremendous abuse from both the right, who didn't like Trump fact checks, and the left, who didn't like fact checks of Bernie Sanders. And it's all, I believe, it's designed to undermine my credibility the next time someone of their ideological ilk encounters one of my fact checks. And I've not figured out a way around that problem.
We do that at Duke with the ACC referees in basketball. We've actually just had a conversation about this week, Joy. We had Jocelyn Benson on campus, the Secretary of State of Michigan, and she's starting in the next few weeks she calls it the Truth-Telling Task Force, which is a tongue twister if there ever was one. And the idea for election misinformation is to get a group of various people who have lots of constituencies to kind of spread accurate information. So now, we don't work that aggressively to spread our fact checks. But as we think about this new age, when we do need to combat misinformation in a more assertive way, I wonder if we need to think about different ways along those lines to spread fact-checking, using sort of trusted voices to reach different audiences. We've mused about, and this is a little bit wacky, but this would get to Uncle Bob, fact checks on gas pumps. So you go to a gas pump and you have a little video that plays, usually it's an ad. What if you put a fact check there and you had whatever the video was reaching the demographic that is likely to be using that gas pump? Now that's kind of an extreme example, but that might be a way to do that. But I think we need to be more creative along those lines.
I hate those ads. I never pay attention to them.
Thank you.
Great question. Thanks, Joy.
Hi, my name is Mar Cabra. I'm the co-founder of the Self-Investigation, which is a nonprofit that supports media with their well-being and mental health. And I want to bring my question to this topic, especially because, Sérgio, you actually showed some very terrifying data of the amount of violence against journalists in Folha de São Paulo. So the question is to you, Sérgio, what did Folha de São Paulo did to support the journalists that received online threats? What are your protocols around this topic? And what are you doing to do preventative training to your staff on these topics? And I also want to extend the question to the other panelists, especially Bill, since you've been doing this for so long. What are the mental health tools and practices that you've seen work, and what do you think is needed to really provide all of you the support that you need to do this job well? Thank you.
It's a great question. Yes, we had to act on three different fronts, the legal, security, and mental health. The first one, we reboot our legal team. Besides our legal department, we have two of the main legal firms working 24/7 for Folha on civil and criminal cases. Second, we offered security detail every time a reporter asked us to do so. Patricia did, and she got security detail for as long as she wanted. The goal was and is, of course, to have the newsroom always feel safe to do their job. And the third, mental health, I think it's the most important, or at least the one with the most impact in the newsroom. In the height of pandemic, but which was also the second year of Bolsonaro in power, we hired a therapist. We called her our therapist at large. She's paid by the newspaper, and she do sessions with reporters Monday to Friday, 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. You just have to call and schedule a session with her. No questions asked. I mean, no questions asked by us, but she will ask a lot of questions. And it's been fully booked since we launched this program.
That's great. Human Rights Watch has hired a therapist too, by the way. It's really interesting. Thank you.
That's a great and important question. I'm not completely current because I'm not currently an editor, and I think particularly for PolitiFact, the most difficult times have been the last few years when there have been really terrible attacks on journalists, including fact checkers. I do know the PolitiFact editors have been really on top of this. I know there's an emphasis to really have work-life balance, so there's not, this expectation that people work incredible hours or whatever. People can have a life after hours. And this goes back to when I was editor. We actually encouraged our reporters to not read social media because, and we had a saying, Twitter is not real life, because you could get wrapped up in what Twitter was saying about something, and it could get you pretty fired up. And we felt like if something was wrong, we would hear about it through other channels. And I think that helped a lot.
That's really smart. Khaya, did you want to come in at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a very basic level, having a social circle outside of media is very important. I mean, that seems really obvious, but I think it's not so obvious for people who work in this industry. And also making sure I always had amazing editors. The people I worked with were so supportive, and anytime I was threatened with a lawsuit or something, I knew that I had people backing me. That was key. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't feel like I had that kind of support.
We've really come a long way in the profession. I mean, I remember in the 1980s, if you got into trouble at Reuters for your stories, they would just put you on the night shift in Cyprus. I'm not kidding. You'd have someone who'd covered Tibet, somebody who'd covered Turkey. They all just got bunged there. Things have really, really changed. Are there any last questions from the audience or last thoughts from the panel before I let everybody go and enjoy themselves?
I just have a quick question. Sorry, David Clinch, mostly for Bill, but for the others as well too. Talking about local fact-checking and the lack of it, and I have not read the report, so I'm just riffing on what you were saying. Is there a potential market for fact-checking as a service, essentially, if a local news organization wants something to be fact-checked, that it could be put into the hopper, essentially, for fact-checkers that are available to fact-check it for them to do that? Or maybe even to have a sort of a shared services kind of approach where fact checks that are done by one local news organization are shared across an ecosystem or a network?
Yes, so there have been a variety of efforts in that way. Chandran Sankaran has a really interesting exercise underway called Repustar, or GigaFact is actually the local one, and it tries to make local fact-checking really fast and economical. And they're doing it in Wisconsin and Nevada, and that's showing promise. It has some limitations. It has to be a yes/no answer, but it's really intriguing. The idea of consortiums is really intriguing. We're toying with the idea of trying to get together a kind of flood the zone cooperative. We tried a smaller version of this in North Carolina. We're considering trying to do this in another state in 2024, where you put so many fact checkers in a state that you might be able to create what someone called herd immunity, that there's so much fact checking that you, along the lines of what you said, that you discourage politicians from lying. And so if we could get enough fact checkers in one place, could we really have an impact? So, but that would require the sort of sharing that you're talking about, David. So I'm hopeful, and I guess I just want to emphasize, I'm hopeful about all this. As the PolitiFact founder, I believe that this is critical. I just think we need to find new ways to get it out to people.
That's it. Good. In that case, I just want to say what a great first day of the conference. Rosenthal and Mallory, you brought together an amazing group. I had never actually met anyone on this panel before, but I've been following all of your work for years. So really honored to have been able to chair this, and thank you so much. And now we go to the courtyard in a few minutes for our party. Is that right? Fantastic. Thanks, everybody.